I mean, what did you find in looking at other cases, and in how people make that initial decision when there is a moment after, during a transition from an autocratic regime where people are having a discussion about changing the electoral system and the political system more generally, and the issue of the balance of power between the presidency and the parliament is being discussed openly. Because once those decisions are made, they're hard to undo. I mean, now that Egypt has, even under Morsi's constitution, the president was powerful. The prime minister also was, but still, we're not talking about a weak ceremonial president like you have in Turkey or Israel, for example. So once that happens, that's going to have a certain effect down the road. There's a kind of path dependency there that a presidential system makes certain outcomes more or less likely. And that can be dangerous, I think. And I think in some Latin American countries, we see a similar problem, with the rise of Chavez in Venezuela, where you have a very top-heavy presidency he's trying to consolidate power. What can we learn? Are there cases where you saw Latin American countries moving away from presidential systems and saying, we understand the danger of a strong president, we're going to embrace a kind of pure parliamentary system?
Often the political system you inherit is the one you live with. And once a president is in place, he's very reluctant to dilute his own power, his or her own powers. And I can say his and her when we're referring to Latin America.
Yes, you tend to inherit the system that was there before, but I think sometimes there's at least a moment where you can have a discussion about this when there's a lot of anger towards the previous regime and people want to think about changing the political structures. And one of those things could be, we had a bad experience with a strong president. Can we find a way through a constitutional process to weaken his power and empower the parliament? So there's a very kind of brief moment where I think you can have that discussion, right?
I think that's right, and it depends on how that brief moment gets used. I mean, ideally, and I write about this in the book, constitution writing takes place behind the veil of ignorance, that people sit down before they really know what their place is within the political system and how strong their particular political party is going to be. And they write a constitution sort of blindly, not knowing whether they're going to be the majority party or the minority party.
But don't they usually have a sense of that?
Yeah, I think they usually do.
Yeah.
And so most constitution writing takes place within a broader political context of what the opportunities are. But where countries can, I think the idea of a sort of round table or a constitutional process that brings all stakeholders to the table before you move to parliamentary and presidential elections. People sitting down and hashing out a constitution before it's really clear who's in power and who this constitution is actually being written for. Is a good thing where it's possible.
Yeah, I think that
It all depends on politics.
I think that was lacking certainly in the Egyptian context, where at the very beginning there was a lopsided power imbalance. Everyone had a general sense that the Brotherhood was the strongest party. That before any elections happened, before we knew just how much electoral strength they had. So, I mean, one of the debates was, should we move to either a pure parliamentary system or a mixed system, or stick with a kind of top-heavy presidential system? And it was actually liberals and non-Islamists more generally who are very reticent to have a pure parliamentary system with a weak ceremonial president, because they saw groups like the Brotherhood as having a kind of built-in advantage when it came to the parliamentary process, again, because of their strength in local districts outside major urban areas. They have the best get-out-the-vote operation, so on and so forth, and they believed that they had a better chance to win the presidency because they, on the national level, they're able to make their case more effectively in the national media. people might be reticent about having an Islamist president who's controversial on the international stage, so on and so forth. So because you had that lopsided power imbalance, liberals were thinking ahead of time and saying, we don't want a pure parliamentary system. Let's have a mixed system. Oddly, ironically enough, there was an Islamist president, Morsi won. So, but the point remains, and I think you see something similar in Tunisia, where again, there was a decision to move towards a mixed system because liberals felt confident that they could at least keep the presidency. So they had President Marzouki, who's part of a secular party, and the Islamists there generally they don't want to monopolize power. So there's a basic understanding that we can have a liberal president and then an Islamist-led parliament, and you have a kind of balance there. So I think it's unfortunate that very early on there was that lopsided power imbalance, and people acted accordingly, and that distorted, I think, the outcomes of the constitutional process.
But I wouldn't overplay sort of the differences between presidential and parliamentary systems. For better or worse, Egypt's probably stuck with a presidential system, but there are countries that have been very successful with presidential systems, and ones that have been very successful with parliamentary systems. I think the larger challenge in Egypt is how do you create other institutions beyond the state, which sort of holds a pharaonic position within Egyptian society. One of the reasons the military continues to be popular, I think, is because it's just the only remaining institution that works within Egyptian society. And I think the challenge for Egyptians is to get beyond that, to have other institutions that serve as a check, but also other institutions that they can rely on. It's a very top-heavy state at the moment that really dominates in a way that you don't find in many other countries.